Today's session focuses on an issue that's really core to our work at LGIU. We've been covering local elections in depth for well over 10 years now, which is part of our core mission to support local democracy. We think that local elections don't always get the attention they deserve. Too often they're treated as an adjunct or as a sort of glorified opinion poll. So that's why we're here today, to talk about the real issues involved in these local elections, to talk about some of the sort of key predictions and ones to watch across England, Scotland and Wales, but also to talk about what councils are up against delivering these polls in difficult times, and to talk a little bit about candidates' experience on the campaign trail. We'll finish with a sneak preview of some exclusive polling we've done with Ipsos on these issues. So I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. So the way this is going to work is we're going to hear from each of our speakers briefly, and then we'll throw it open for Q&A. I'll explain this at the time, but Q&A you can do either by raising your hand Zoom-wise or by putting something in the chat, and I'll try and get through as many questions as possible. We have a great lineup of speakers for you. First of all, we're going to hear from Peter Stanyon at the AEA, the Association of Electoral Administrators, which he can say less tongue-twistingly than me, followed by LGIU's very own Ingrid Koehler, our head of content, who's going to talk about some of the ones to watch. Then we're going to hear from Allan Faulds from Ballot Box Scotland on what might happen in Scotland, really crucial set of local elections in Scotland coming up. And then we'll close with Keiran Pedley from Ipsos talking about some of our new polling data. We're due to finish at 10:45, and we'll try and do that. But if there's a clamour of questions at that point, we might sneak in an extra 5 minutes or so. Right, let's do it. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. Very well said, Association of Electoral Administrators. It rolls off the tongue after a while, but just for those who are not aware of what we do as an organisation, we're basically there to support those who deliver the elections, literally the ones who pushes the piece of paper around, press the buttons, things like that. So that's what we're all about. So I was given the brief of turbulent times, and I think they are turbulent times in terms of the elections coming up. Just looking at some statistics, I've just got off been given this morning. There's just over 21,000 candidates involved on the 5th of May, 136 political parties electing across Great Britain to just shy of 7,000 seats across GB. And of course, we've got the elections in Northern Ireland taking place as well. So the turbulent times are politics, big politics in terms of national, but there's also the local politics taking place as well. We try to put that to one side, and there'll be other conversations about how that impacts turnout at ballot boxes and like as we go through. But I think where we're at in terms of delivery of the elections is, we keep hearing the word business as usual. We're back to business as usual. I would say probably not. I call it BAU plus, because we're not quite back where we were 3 years ago when we last ran polls with pre-COVID and the like. We've got a number of different changes coming in, mayoral elections, we've got the combined authority election in South Yorkshire, we've got the shadow authorities as well. There's lots of turbulence that's taking place around those bits and pieces. But the BAU plus part of it is the fact that whether we like it or not, COVID is still there, and we're having to deal with those implications of delivery. This time last year, every single local authority across Great Britain was involved in elections. That's not the case, a bit more of a patchwork this time around, but that doesn't negate the actual importance of the elections that are taking place. So COVID issues being faced around staffing. It's not just the temporary staff in polling stations. Yes, it's more difficult to get those staff at the moment. Databases were made larger last year through a lot of efforts that are taking place, but there's a constant churn of individuals that we've got that if somebody tests as positive in the run up to a poll, as well as alongside the normal things where people drop out. It's also the core staff, those experts in the offices. Speaking to a colleague only yesterday where they'd lost 3 staff over the last couple of weeks in the prime periods of running the election, around nominations, moving into postal voting and delivering the actual core to the election itself. So that's not gone away. That's still there as a massive issue that needs to be taken account of. Safety of electors. There's an obligation on returning officers to make sure that when electors walk into a polling station, they are safe. So you will see a patchwork again of different approaches being taken. Some will require masks, social distancing, the sanitisation that took place this time last year. Others will not. You may see perspex screens, you may well not. very much local risk assessment taking place, and the good practice that was brought in last year will be rolled out as well in those elements. Elements of the law have changed. In England, certainly, the around nomination subscribers has gone back to the 10 that are required. But there's been massive change in Wales, where there are a brand new set of legislation that our Welsh colleagues are having to use in terms of lots of slight nuances to the way the elections have previously been run. In fact, there are 4 pilots taking place, early voting pilots in Wales, that will be very interesting to watch on. But a huge maelstrom, I would suggest, going on for our friends in Wales. But again, things like emergency proxy legislation is still there for those who've got who test positive for COVID in the run-up to an election itself. How that will work, how that manages in terms of the government guidance around who will be able to apply in those terms, is a little bit more woolly than it was this time last year. But every effort is still being there to make sure the safety of electors and the ability for them to participate is taking place. Other bits and pieces just to flag very, very briefly: the availability of premises. Long been advocating the challenges faced by using schools, for example, which are often the only and often the best premises available. But that's put against the backdrop of the pressures that have been put on schools and pupils over the last couple of years, and the need to try to avoid using wherever possible. But a number of the other traditional premises are no longer there. So there's a massive challenge in coming through, simply have closed down, have become unavailable because of the things that we've been through over the last couple of years in that way. And count processes, bringing in the good practice from last year, they will be more transparent, they will be more open, there will be less stricture over in terms of the way that the counts are being run. But again, they may well not look quite as they were 2 years ago as things develop, as we move forward, and it will vary from location to location. The only thing I'd sort of bring to a conclusion is that the one really important bit that came out of last year's elections was the one council approach. The benefits to the whole authority, seeing their elections as a massive corporate event that the whole authority gets behind. That's something we will continue to advocate. That's something that the sector needs to continue to advocate, and we hope that will be the outcome as we move forward into these May elections, because they may well not be every single local authority, but they're certainly important in the areas the elections taking place. Just to conclude, I think the key element to every single returning officer, registration officer, and electoral administrator is the need to continue to ensure that the results that are coming out at the end of the day are the correct results, they've been confidently delivered, and actually the electors going into polling stations, voting by post, have been given full access, regardless of the challenges that are being faced. So, turbulent times. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Peter. It's so easy to just take elections. We just take for granted that elections happen properly. And I always find it really salutary listening to Peter, because he just reminds us that they only happen safely, securely, and fairly because of an amazing amount of hard work around the country. I know that we're all really grateful to all of Peter's members for that work. Ingrid, big set of elections. What's going on?
Yeah, hi. So I also just want to follow up by giving a big round of thanks to electoral workers, who really are the kind of the foundation of not just our local democracy, but our national democracy, and the kind of sense of what we do in running free and fair elections. And you can probably hear from my accent that I'm from the US and originally, and the pressure that electoral workers are under there and in other places is just can be phenomenal. And we, these guys are really holding it together for us as we go through. One thing, so there's the praise bet. Now I'm gonna have a little bit of a pop in terms of the way that we present our elections information to local people. We saw over the pandemic that people were much more aware of their council, of the council services that they received. They were applauding bin men, but as you'll hear from Keiran later, they seem to have lapsed back into a kind of lack of awareness around what councils do and what councillors do. I'm sure there's nuances to that story that we'll hear later. But I think part of that is the way that we share the information and some of the ways that elections run. So, for example, a lot of those 7,000 seats or so are going to be in where only a third of seats are up for election. And so it can be really difficult for voters to tell what's at stake, who's running. And we find it difficult. And we've been, as Jonathan says, we've been doing this for 10 years, and we sometimes find it difficult to know which seats are actually up for election and what the balance of control is in councils. And so we can all do a lot better at convincing and letting people know that their vote really, really does matter. And sometimes seats are won and lost by like 5 votes, or, you know, if somebody had just made a few more phone calls, they could have won on the night. So that being said, I think the press also has a role to play in saying, you know, look, these are about local issues and local matters. And as Jonathan said, yeah, sometimes these are treated as the glorified opinion poll on national politics. But when you look at it from, you know, the national level, the temptation is always there to do that. But that being said, I think there's a few councils I just wanted to highlight, council races where things are, you know, you should be watching on the night as the votes come in. So Amber Valley has been flipping back and forth over the past few elections and could do so again. Similar story for St. Albans. And of course, a lot of eyes will be on London. I live in London, and so I'm particularly interested, but Wandsworth and Westminster are once again being highlighted as targets to take down the long-standing Conservative administrations. I live in one of those boroughs. I'm not sure, but I think the way that things are going these days, we're still emerging from the pandemic, it's really difficult to tell what the mood on the ground is sometimes. I think the other thing that we'll see in London is how are the Lib Dems and Greens doing in places like Richmond and Kingston, or Greens in particular in places like Lambeth. Is this going to be a big night for Labour in across London? And what about places like Barnet, which were traditionally Conservative for a long time, but have you know, seen that erode over the years? In the Northeast, I think Hartlepool is one that you want to have a look at, where there's been, you know, a history of independents, Conservatives, a UKIP vote, which has obviously collapsed over time. And where is that going to go in these kind of traditional Labour heartlands? In the Northwest, there's a whole new council. It's going to be a whole big new unitary council coming out, but there are still a lot of district councils that elect by thirds. Pendle is one that is usually you want to see how that one goes on the night. I think in the Southwest, again, another big new unitary council. But Plymouth is another one where there's a minority administration, Conservative leader, and has often flipped back and forth over the years. In the West Midlands, Solihull is always one to watch, but also a number of councils that were traditionally Labour for a long, long time. Went Conservative at the last election and have seats up for election again, and just to see where those go. And then Sheffield, which is always an interesting area, is good. I know I'm like running through all these things. I want to say, I know we're running out of time and we've got other great speakers. So I can see Jonathan getting angsty. We have the Ones to Watch publication. It's on our website. It's part of a whole package of information about the elections themselves, as well as support for new councillors, existing councillors, and people who want to know how their local democracy is run. So I will leave it there, and then if there's any questions later.
Thank you, Ingrid. That's great. And I think it's also true that, you know, one of the challenges with local elections, if you know, to try and understand what's going on in terms of national politics, is we're going to have to get really down and dirty into the granular data with this. It's not going to be big councils flipping that much. It's going to be about vote share. It's going to be about seats, and it's going to be about vote share. So the data is going to be very, very, very hard to read. Alan, these are big elections in Scotland. Well, I won't say why. You tell us why. What's going on in Scotland? Why does this matter, and what's going to happen?
What isn't going on in Scotland? So thanks for inviting me. Thanks for inviting me along this morning. This is actually only my second ever public appearance as Ballot Box Scotland. The first was last night on telly, so it's been a bit of a busy week. And I think so part of my role here is to do what Scottish people always do and go, it's different up here. And that's both in terms of having quite a distinct sphere of politics. It's not Labour and the Conservatives that are competing in Scotland. It's they're competing with the SNP, and of course also by the use of PR for council. So we're going to have very few, if any, majority councils elected next month. I think there's kind of two ways of looking at these local elections. And there's the way that I think a lot of attendees here would like, is that being about essential local services we rely on in our daily lives. Also long-term visions for our communities around, for example, climate action. You know, that's something that all parties now recognise that there needs to be action on. And also about a decade of cuts that have put those kind of services and those sort of visions at risk. And also that falls on decades of centralisation of power, resources, and also geography. Like the size of councils in the UK is quite abnormal by European standards. Then there's the way they'll actually be seen and talked about, which is in Scotland is another front in the constitutional debate. You cannot get away from that at any level. Every election is about that. And then secondary to that, the same kind of sort of usual party horse races. And of course, both of these kind of aspects are why these votes matter. They're just sort of different ways of looking at it. And at Ballot Box Scotland, excuse me, I'm sort of better equipped to talk about the horse race kind of things. And there's sort of two big battlegrounds. Obviously, there's the fact that the SNP have been dominant in Scotland since 2011, but they've never translated their parliamentary dominance to local level. Comfortably over 40% of votes, roughly 50% of seats at Holyrood for the past 3 elections, but only a third of votes, a third of seats in recent local elections. So there's a question of can they make up that ground? And their prospects are looking kind of mixed this year. Most polling looks good. They appear to have recovered from a record low in 2017, which was a bad year overall. So they could be headed for a record result. But on the other hand, their regional result was sort of only just over 40% last year. The polling there is now in the mid-30s, and past experiences, they tend to do closer to that than they do to sort of first past post polls where their vote share is inflated. They've also kind of shot themselves in the foot with a lot of sort of under nominations in rural councils, and including failing to find candidates in 3 mainland wards for the first time. The other big question in Scotland then is who's going to come second. Obviously, the Conservatives took that position in 2017, displaced Labour, but that was a real peak in their support, and they haven't been at that peak since. So they're always likely to lose some seats in some places this year, but you add in the effect of the lockdown parties, all of those revelations, that's sort of taking support down, and that could have much more substantial losses coming up. And that means that Labour are the party that are benefiting. You know, that they could be coming back into second place. That'd be a big boost for Anna Sarwar. And of course, the constitution is key here. Whoever comes second gets to sort of most credibly claim that only we can stop the SNP and defend the union. And this could kind of make one leader's career and break the others. And that's not the only way the constitution has sort of impacted the election. It's impacted how our councils will be governed as well, because parties have been sort of falling over themselves to rule out various coalitions even before a single vote has been cast. You know, Labour in particular have been quite nationally sceptical, though some of the local parties are less sort of keen on that national message. They've got a particular catch-22 where if they're in coalition with the SNP, as they are in 6 councils, the Conservatives point and go, Labour aren't serious about the union, look, they're cooperating with the SNP. Whereas if they work with the Conservatives, and there's only one formal coalition that led to the councillors being suspended, but a lot more Labour minorities with tacit Conservative support. It's the SNP shouting, look, Labour are putting the union before local services. So you can kind of see why they perhaps don't want to go for any kind of coalition. But as I said, we use proportional representation. Ruling out coalitions is basically pretending PR doesn't exist, and really seems quite daft. Cross-party cooperation in Scotland isn't optional, it's essential. And there's a risk then of ending up locked out of governance entirely. So can that hard line hold? You know, does it pay electoral dividends to be seen to standing up against parties that you're sort of saying are the parties most to blame for a decade of funding cuts and service cuts? Or is that seen as abdicating responsibility and missing out on opportunities communities to exercise power and deliver positive change. So it's a really big gamble. Notably, we've had a lot less of this from the two smaller of what I call the 5 Holyrood parties. The Lib Dems have ruled out coalitions with the SNP in Edinburgh, where they have councillors and that could be relevant, and in Glasgow where they don't, but they haven't done so for nationwide, and that could be key in places like Aberdeenshire and parts of rural Scotland. The Lib Dems might prove willing to go into coalition with the SNP there, and it's hard to get a read of how well the Lib Dems will do overall this year. They had the worst ever Holyrood result last year, but actually their polling's been quite good so far over the past few months. Greens also likely to have sort of slow and steady growth rather than a big breakthrough. The STV voting system slightly less proportional than for the Scottish Parliament, so they won't win quite as many seats, but could make it onto a few new councils. And of course, they entered into national government with the SNP in the Scottish Parliament last year. The question is, will they now take a similar step at local level? And an opposite case to the Lib Dems, the only places that's looking likely would be Glasgow and Edinburgh, where the Greens have long established and substantial council groups. And one sort of final sort of horse race thing is that it's interesting to look set to be quite a bad year for independents in Scotland. Lowest number of independent candidates in a very long time, especially in Highland, where they were historically sort of the dominant force. The sort of question there is there a bit of an exodus? You know, has STV made it harder to be an independent when you're facing more credible challenges from political parties? I don't have an answer to that, but that's a sort of question to raise. Now, just to wrap up, all of that, of course, then has a direct impact on the services that are delivered and what councils' priorities are. You know, some places want to invest more in public and active transport, others want roads back to full capacity. Limited resources might go towards fixing up schools in some areas, and others, the defining local issue will be bins, everyone's favourite sort of local thing. And it's not an issue that councils themselves can control, but we are increasingly at the point where something has to be done about council tax. It's frankly a badly designed tax. Reform has been in the agenda in Scotland for years. We had a commission on it in 2014, and unlike Wales, Scotland hasn't had a revaluation. We're using the same council tax values from when I was a year old, and I'm now pushing 32. So these financial pressures aren't just causing difficulty in the abstract, they're actually making councillors, like, frankly miserable, left feeling powerless, that they can't deliver the things they want in their communities. So it really feels like we're hitting a breaking point on this, and that something has to give, and when it does, that'll have a massive implication for councils. So I hope that's been a sort of useful whistle-stop tour of Scotland.
Tremendously useful, Alan. Thank you. Although I agree with you about council tax, but I'm not holding my breath. We've been waiting a long time. So really interesting. You focused in on that question, like, we can see this as a sort of horse race about the main parties, or we can, as we always say at LGIU, it's about local issues. Well, actually, how do the public understand it? We've been asking them. Keiran, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. My name's Keiran. I'm Director of Politics at Ipsos. I had intended to be on screen from the office. Unfortunately, my son's nursery lost their key, which made me miss my train. So I'm back at home with dodgier Wi-Fi, so you have to deal with my floating name. I think someone's sharing, Jen, you're sharing a screen of some slides. We've done some work with LGIU, looking at some opinion polling of the general public in the UK. So this is a poll of 2,076 UK adults aged 18 to 75. And we've been asking about sort of their understanding of local government, and also their sort of perceptions of the role that local councils play in our society. And there's also a couple of slides at the end, which I'll take you through, which look at some other polling that we've been doing separately, which I think might be of interest. But Jen, I don't know, are you sharing screen?
It should be coming up now, Keiran.
Okie doke. Trying to work out where. Okay, perfect. So yes, I'm going to do my best Chris Whitty impression. Apologies for that again. So just to start off, we'll go through this. It's only about 10 slides, but I thought it'd be better to show visuals rather than sort of throw numbers at you. So yeah, next slide's fine. First of all, just to remind ourselves who actually votes in local elections. What I would say is ignore the actual 65% figure. We know that in surveys, people overstate their likelihood to show up. We know that surveys, it's easier to get people to vote that don't. What I'm most interested in here is the relative position of different demographics. So this, what you can see in the bar chart here is the proportion of UK adults that say they always or usually or often, vote in local elections compared to those that rarely or never. And the blank sort of white in the middle is people that say they sometimes vote or don't want to tell us. The point here is that overall, we know this, but older people are much more likely to vote, and just to Robert, yes, these will be shared after the event. older people are much more likely to vote than younger people, twice as likely in this case. When we look at the 55 to 75s versus the 18 to 24s. Similarly, graduates and ABC ones more likely to show up than non-graduates or C2DEs. I don't think this is going to be news to a lot of people on the call, so it'll be next slide. But just when later on I do talk about what voters versus non-voters think about local elections, we should just bear in mind that voters tends to skew towards that older graduate ABC1 demographic. We asked people how well informed they felt about why it's important to vote in general elections and local elections. And I suppose the encouraging news here on the local elections front is that 7 in 10 feel well informed about why it's important to vote. At the same time, we should acknowledge that 1 in 4 do not feel well informed about why it's important to vote in local elections. And I always say, 1 in 4 is a good chunk of people, even if 7 in 10 is the overwhelming majority. And we can obviously see the relative position there to general elections, which I don't think will be news to people. People will sort of understand the importance of generals over locals. So broad support, broad understanding of the importance of locals, but strong minority not so. So the next slide shows that by demographics. Again, a similar pattern to what I showed you a moment ago with voters versus non-voters. But what you can see here is that particularly what I'd like to call out is that your 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds, in fact, really 1 in 3 of those under the age of 35 don't feel very well informed about why it's important to vote in local elections. I think this is particularly key when we think of LGIU's mission and the mission of others on this call. Similar pattern seen with non-graduates, almost 3 in 10 not feeling well informed. And as you might expect, those people that vote regularly in these elections overwhelmingly see the appeal, see the points. But those that don't, either rarely or never, a majority, don't feel well informed about why it's important. So next slide. So clearly there's a challenge there, right? There's a challenge about sort of making people understand why it matters to turn up. And when we factor in what we know turnout is in local elections versus generals, I don't think that will be new news. We also asked people how much, if anything, you'd say you'd know about the work of different groups or organisations. So what you can see here is a comparison of how much people know about what local councils do and what local councillors do versus MPs in Parliament. I think the point here is that clearly more than half of the public say they don't know very much or anything at all about the work of local councillors or how decisions are made in their local council. So this just feeds that point, I think, about a general sense of superficial knowledge, shall we say, in the broad public sphere. The next slide shows how this splits among people that vote always or often in local elections. This is the one that I've highlighted in green here, versus those that sometimes vote or rarely never vote. The context here that should be taken into account, as I mentioned earlier, based on this sample, about 2/3 of our sample said that they always or often vote. So from a sort of proportionate perspective, the majority is very much what I've highlighted in green there. But at the same time, what we can see here is that people that either sometimes, rarely, or never vote, clear majorities say they don't know very much or anything about the role of local councillors or how decisions are made locally. But I think what's striking to me here is even those that always or often vote, it's pretty split actually. Almost half say that they don't know how decisions are taken at their local council or what about the role of the local councillors. We also asked a very similar question, which you can look at separately in the polling, about how confident people are that they could explain the role of local councillors or councils. The numbers were very similar, so I haven't bothered putting them here, but a similar pattern here that overwhelmingly, knowledge is stronger amongst those that vote, but actually even amongst that group, it's split. Next slide, please. Having said that, on a positive note for local government, when we asked people from a long list that we provided, which 2 or 3 of the, if any, have the most impact on people's everyday lives or the quality of life in your area, you can see that despite not necessarily knowing much detail about how local government works, the public clearly acknowledge that local councils have the most strongest impact on people's everyday lives, and particularly the impact of quality of life in their area. You can see a slight difference there in the ranking of where local councillors fall. Sort of what's that, 6th on the list on everyday lives, but number 2 on the impact of the quality of life in your area. So you've got a situation where people don't necessarily have strong degrees of knowledge in how things work, but they do recognise the importance of local government. I think that's very, very important. Next slide, please. Having said that, I think that when you have these discussions, it's very easy to say, well, we just need to tell people what local government does then, don't we? It's just that's easy, and then it'll all change next year and it'll all be fine. Well, the problem is that you've got an audience with the public that don't necessarily want to know or don't necessarily want to be sort of actively involved or receiving more information. So what you can see on screen here is we've got a list of statements related to local councils. So which of these statements, if any, comes closest to your views about how local councils make decisions about local public services in your area, just to be clear. And what you can see is, I'll read these out quickly, just so people can, who maybe can't see the screen or are listening in, know the results. So 16% tell us they're not interested in knowing how decisions are made in their local area, as long as the local council does its job. I should also say we've got 4% that don't say any of these choices I'm about to list, and 4% that don't know. So you've got a decent chunk of people, around 1 in 5, that are just disengaged. As long as the council seems to be doing its job, as far as they're concerned, they're happy to just let things go. A third, or just over a third, 35%, say they'd like to know more about how decisions are taken in their area, but they don't want to be involved beyond that. So it's an information exercise as opposed to necessarily being actively involved. 28% say they would like to have more of a say in how decisions are taken in their area. So what that means is you've got 63%, almost 2/3, saying that they either want more information about what happens in their local area or more say in decisions that are made locally. Beyond that, we've got 9% that say they'd like to be more actively involved in how decisions are made, and 5% say that they already are. So that's 14% say they either want to be more involved or they already are involved. Very similar number to that 16% that said they're not interested. So I think this is an important data point, and one to sort of digest as you look at the polling maybe after this call. It's one thing to say that, you know, people don't necessarily feel informed, even though they recognise the importance of councils. But at the same time, you've got large numbers that aren't necessarily going, you know, overtly wanting to be engaged. So it's a hard audience to reach in some instances, even if people generally do say they want more information or want more say. Final couple of slides from me then. So just briefly on, we asked about to what extent do you think local councillors are doing a good or bad job in a number of areas. Around 1 in 3, broadly, I won't go through all of these, you can look at this separately. 1 in 3 think local councillors are doing good jobs on things like providing information on issues and services in their areas, telling people about the work they do, dealing with complaints and issues and things of that nature. I think this just feeds to that wider point about people not necessarily knowing what councillors actually do, because when you look at people that vote, these scores increase. But like final 2 slides from me then, we'll be pleased to know. A separate poll that we ran, just to give you a bit of additional context for the Press Association, we had 3 in 4 say that they're satisfied with their neighbourhood as a place to live. And when we ask how satisfied are you with what local councils are doing to improve things in your local area, 34% say they're satisfied and 31% say they're dissatisfied. So a split picture. At the same time, when we ask the same question on UK government, only 24% say they're satisfied with what UK government is doing to improve things in their local area. Now, of course, part of that might be just simply a reflection of jurisdiction and where people's emphasis is, but at least it's encouraging for local councils that they're seen as doing a better job for the local area than central government. And then the final slide, which may not surprise people, thinking about your local area, which of the following features, if any, do you think would most need improving? Well, it's roads and pavements, 50%. So I call this on the final slide to paraphrase Tony Blair, instead of education, education, education. I think in local government it's potholes, 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 or at least that seems what this data is suggesting. Obviously, a range of issues that people do care about, of course, things around housing, healthcare, health services, local jobs, and shops on the high street, the cleanliness of streets, and so on and so forth. You can see the long list there. It's not one thing above and beyond everything else, that nothing else matters. But at the same time, you know, locally people do care about roads and pavements very much. So what have we learned in this whistle-stop tour of this exclusive polling? So the final slide. So just to recap, what we find is the majority of the public recognise the importance of voting in local elections, although there is this large minority that don't, which is important, primarily driven by younger people and non-graduates. The public do acknowledge that councils have the biggest impact on everyday lives and the quality of life in their local area, and they're generally thought of having a more positive impact locally than central government. Yet a majority do not know much about the work councillors do or how decisions are made locally. Even large numbers of people that actually vote regularly in local elections still say that. A clear majority of the public either want more information or more of a say in how local councils make decisions about services, but we would describe this desire as shallow, a desire for shallow rather than deep involvement, I think, as we went through on the slide a moment ago. And then just to finish, in terms of what people prioritize locally, potholes, roads and pavements, top of the list. So hopefully that's of interest. This is being published shortly after this event, I believe, so you'll be able to look at the data tables and the full slide pack in more detail then, but hopefully for now that gives you some food for thought in this event.
Thanks, Keiran, that's brilliant. And yes, we will be publishing this straight after the event. Really interesting findings, and I think it's slightly salutary for all of us that there's more work to do in helping people understand what it is that councils deliver for the public, and we're certainly trying to do that at LGIU. We're working on a project for the second year running with the BBC, producing some infographics that show for each council having an election exactly where their money is being spent to help people understand where the money's going and what they're making decisions about. And on our website we have our sort of one-stop shop for local government with all the kind of latest analysis and information about local elections. We've got a few minutes for questions. I'm going to take a mixture of hands that I see in the virtual room and stuff that's come in on the chat. Just one quick one from the chat already because he got in very quick. Martin George with a question for Peter. You talked about a lot of traditional venues not being available and that there's sort of alternative venues being found. Could you just say a little bit about what sort of places those are and why that's problematic?
Yeah, I can give a very quick answer to Martin. It goes across the board. It can be anything from community centres to pubs to rooms, whatever, just becoming unavailable, which is a traditional thing. It happens all the time, but it's just sort of speeded up as a result of COVID. In terms of the alternatives, yes, alternatives have to be found. There is no option to that, but that can in some instances mean either having to go into educational schools, for example, or indeed even temporary polling stations and the like. But whatever happens, there will be a venue available in the local area, but it's just a constant flow in terms of the venues becoming unavailable in that way.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to take one from the floor. Alex Morales. You might.
Hi, I was just trying to unmute. Yeah, I think all of the speakers just about touched on how national politics does feed into local elections, whether it should or not. I think, Ingrid, you put it a glorified opinion poll. Some people treat it as a glorified opinion poll on national politics. And I was wondering if I can get your take on to what extent people do this. Also, very specifically at this election, I think there are probably a couple of national domestic issues, Partygate and the cost of living crisis. I was wondering how much you think these will feed into decisions people make when they go to the ballot box. So I'd like to ask that of Ingrid and Keiran, if possible, both of you.
Sure. Keiran first, then Ingrid.
Thanks, Alex. It's a difficult thing to quantify, is the honest answer, because ultimately we do have a poll in the field at the moment about this, asking about which factors will influence their vote more. I think it would be sort of almost naive not to think that the national picture plays quite a significant part in not only how people vote, but whether people want to vote as well. I mean, like the mood music around the government at the moment is very challenging. Our Ipsos political monitor shows economic optimism the weakest it's been since the financial crash in 2008, even weaker than the start of the pandemic. We've got significant concern about the cost of living as an issue, people really feeling that, and people concerned about Rishi Sunak, and his ratings have plummeted for different reasons, as we know, some related to the economy and the spring statement, some related to other things. So, and of course, we've had the re-emergence of Partygate, which has led us to show in our polling around 54% think the Prime Minister should resign as a result of receiving a fixed penalty notice. So all of those conditions taken together do create a negative set for the Conservatives.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, as you've seen the poll,
We can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Oh, you can? Okay, it's me.
Yeah. Okay. So as you saw from the polling, a lot of people are kind of, and they, say that they're likely to vote in a way that they probably won't be. So a lot of local elections is actually about getting out the vote. And that is about enthusiasm from activists on the ground and from counselors. And when things are tricky on a national level, and that's what they're encountering on the doorstep, it can become quite disheartening to local activists, to knock on another door or deliver another leaflet, because of that information gap that local voters sometimes have around those local issues. So I think that's kind of where that really, really drives things, is that it's a lot harder to get people out to vote when you've got, negative mood music, no matter what it is. Yeah.
Great. And just following up on that, there's a sort of question on the chat from Michael. Is there sufficient educational information about the voting system, where it differs from general elections, so multi-member in London, STV in Scotland? Can the media and government do more to explain these systems? So I think the answer to that, I'm going to answer that. No, there isn't enough educational information. Yes, the media could do more. Yes, government could do more. Yes, we could all do more. I think there's a sort of responsibility we all have to take as citizens for that general information. Allan, there's a bunch of quite complicated questions in the chat about Scotland, about the SNP, about how they're kind of playing the voting system, asking people only to vote for their candidates despite STV. This is quite hard, but can you kind of roughly sum up the sort of those questions in terms of how you think the SDP are going to do in terms of whether they're going to underperform their polling, whether the system in Scotland is how the system is going to play into all of that?
Yeah, so just in terms of sort of the leaflets from the SNP, they're kind of suggesting vote SNP 1, 2, and then done, don't vote for anyone else. I find that really quite curious. Like, I certainly don't expect anyone in Scotland to be sort of calling for people, telling people what other parties to give later preferences to. Though interestingly, in Australia, where they live and die by preferential voting, they do that. But it's quite, that should extend to telling people not to use later preferences. So that is quite bizarre. In terms of the prospect for underperformance, I think that the SNP in Scotland kind of inhabit the same place that Labour do sort of in England and Wales, which is that a lot of their voter base are people from sort of more deprived areas who have a lower propensity to vote, and younger voters who have a lower propensity to vote. And that means that at council elections where turnout is lower, that could be a large part of why in previous years the SNP haven't been able to sort of convert their sort of poll figures into votes and seats. And in fact, in 2017 at Westminster, when the SNP had quite a bad year, the seats they lost to Labour in the Central Belt weren't because Labour had a massive recovery in votes. They were because lots of their voters in 2015 just stayed home. And by contrast, the Conservatives then tend to have the people that tend to have sort of older voters, wealthier voters who tend to turn out more. And I think that could be something that has an impact in the elections next month, that we sort of see things a bit better for the Conservatives than they might be expecting and a bit worse for the SNP.
Brilliant. Thank you, Allan. Charlotte Rose from the BBC. Heard from some colleagues in English regions who've been told that members of the press aren't allowed to attend the count. They can only watch virtually. What guidance is the AEA giving on this, Peter?
Well, we wouldn't be the ones to give the guidance. That'd be more Electoral Commission. But transparency is the important bit to any count that's taking place. So basically will depend on local circumstance, but generally speaking, returning officers do invite members of the media to attend their counts so they can see it in the flesh effectively. I'm not aware of any specific one, but if you'd like to contact me, happy to help on that one. But effectively, it will, if that is the message coming out, will be to do with the actual venues themselves, just make it almost impossible to provide that transparency. But generally, we would expect media to be able to attend at the returning officer's invitation.
Okay. There was also a niche question, Peter, about perspex screens, but I think that in a way that's all part of the same issue, isn't it? That given the kind of levels of disruption, given that we're having to use venues we haven't used before, given that we're not, some of the sort of standard venues we have used are not available, just all of these issues are more complex and more variable and more difficult than they would ideally be.
It's local decision. It all comes down to local risk assessment and the like, and there's not guidance to use them. They were used last year. But in some areas you will see it, in others you won't. It depends on local circumstance.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, everybody, I think we are out of time. Indeed, we are slightly over time. So I'm going to bring things to a close. What I wanted to say before I close and before I do some quick thank yous is that we will be releasing the sort of full findings of that research that Ipsos have done for us very shortly, and we will circulate that to all of you so that you will have that. You can see all of that information. For those of you LGIU members, council, doers on the call, do check out our website, our one-stop shop on everything to do with local elections. There's a huge amount of really rich and we hope very helpful for you material on that. For those of you joining us from the media, I guess my key message is, yes, of course, national politics matter. Yes, of course, that's important. But whatever reason people vote for, whether it's about what they want to say about national politics, whether it's about changing how things are delivered in their area, the important thing is that they vote. And so I think the more we can all tell the story of why local elections matter, both in terms of their outcomes and in terms of a sort of a civic participation in the democratic process, I think the more we can all do that, the better. It's an essential part of our democracy, and it really, really matters now more than ever. Okay, enough preaching. Some thanks. Thanks Jen, Simone, and team for putting this on. Thanks Ipsos for working with us on the polling. Really fascinating, as I say, quite salutary. I think shows us how much work we have to do. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Keiran. Thank you, Ingrid. Really, really interesting insights from all of you. So really grateful for your time. And of course, most of all, thank you to all of you in the audience for your participation, for your questions, and for spending time with us this morning. We'll be in touch with all the details and all the sort of research that you can follow up on. Any further questions, always feel free to give me a shout. Give Ingrid or Jen a shout. We're always here to sort of answer questions from our members. So we look forward to hearing you. I think the most awkward thing, as I always say about Zoom meetings, is the ending of them. So I just do it brutally. Thank you. Goodbye.